What if I told you that New Hampshire, Maine, Montana, Rhode Island, Delaware, the Dakotas, Vermont, and Wyoming, all the governors of those states had a press conference and said, starting in 2023, every new house is going to be electric, fully electric homes. And a couple years after that, every new building, with a couple exceptions, but essentially every new building is also going to be electric. That would be pretty big news, especially when Tucker Carlson started programming segments about eco-fascism taking hold in the US. Now, this didn't happen in those states, but a version of it did happen somewhere. More on that in a minute. Buildings produce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. It's taken a huge backseat to things like transportation, but according to the EPA, it's 13% of greenhouse gas emissions. There are 70 million gas-burning buildings in the US, and for a place like New York, it's just buildings. My own building, the building behind me, the building across the street, the buildings that way, that tall building. Now, part of this is the gas stove, but that isn't the biggest part. Water heating and space heating, which use the same gas as the stove, are responsible for 40% of New York City's greenhouse gas emissions. This doesn't have to be the case. There are lots of homes with electric heating, but right now, less than 1% of New York City's buildings are heated with electric. And the easiest way to grow that number is to just make sure that all new buildings are electric. 2,000 buildings go up in New York City every year, and there don't have to be gas hookups in hardly any of them. But gas companies obviously don't want anyone constructing buildings without gas hookups, because that means no customers in that building. This is why they've gone to great lengths to manufacture desire for gas stoves, going so far as to pay influencers to produce pro-gas social media posts. Because if there's demand for gas stoves, even though gas for cooking makes up only 3% of natural gas sales, because if you want a gas stove, then there has to be a gas hookup. And if that's there, then you can just go ahead and install the standard gas heating system, which is where the real money for gas companies comes in. Now, there are a few key reasons why we want to avoid this, and avoid even installing a gas hookup to begin with. For one thing, when natural gas combusts indoors, such as the open flame in our kitchens, fine particulate matter, nitrogen, sulfur oxides, and other things that are really bad for our bodies are just released into the air. So it makes sense that a study found that pollution from fuel combustion in residential and commercial buildings in New York led to an estimated 1,940 premature deaths in 2017, not to mention the occasional explosion.
Preliminary evidence suggests a gas-related explosion. That investigation is ongoing.
But explosions are relatively rare. The bigger issue is what gets put into the air every day by natural gas burning. Ozone, or trioxygen, is a primary ingredient in smog. When ozone is in the air, it makes it harder to breathe. It can make the lungs more susceptible to infection. It aggravates things like asthma, emphysema, chronic bronchitis. This is why the EPA sets limits on ozone levels, which New York City consistently blows right through. Actually, it's the highest in the entire country. This is driven primarily by combustion emissions in New York City buildings. So there are immediate health ramifications as well as obvious climate ramifications, and here's the thing. Yes, there are regulations that are going to be ramping up in the next decade in New York City, and the goal is to reach net zero by 2050. But that goal doesn't have to be met, and the regulations don't have to actually be enforced. It's expensive to retrofit buildings to be totally electric, and when a gas-burning building goes up, we're committing to a certain level of emissions from that building for however long it stands, depending of course upon regulations and their enforcement. But an all-electric building goes up, the particulate matter, the ozone, the greenhouse gas that would have come from your stove and heating don't exist. Now yes, the electric we use comes from fossil fuels, a lot of it. That's true, 85% of New York City's electricity comes from fossil fuels. That is an enormous problem, without question. But electricity can become clean, whereas gas-burning water heaters can't. Plus, the electricity you're using for your induction burner isn't emitting pollutants from an open flame directly into your apartment and lungs. So no, the states I mentioned earlier did not just decide to make all new buildings electric, but you add up the populations of those states and you have the population of New York City, which did just decide to make all new buildings electric. The bill that just passed in New York effectively mandates that starting in 2023, all new buildings 6 floors and under will have to be electric, and new buildings 7 floors and taller will have to adjust in 2027. Obviously, it could be better, it could always be better, but this is a good example of the kind of change that's really going to help achieve emissions goals, which is because it simply cuts off the source of emissions. not carbon taxes or offsets or paper straws, a clear source of harmful pollutants, and a mandate to just stop. No more gas heating or stoves. This legislation came after a campaign led by the Gas-Free NYC Coalition, which includes New York Communities for Change, NYPIRG, We Act for Environmental Justice, and Food and Water Watch. It's likely going to be a lot more efforts from groups like these that get us to the point where entire states are adopting this policy. Conversely, the new mayor, Eric Adams, once indicated during a televised election debate that he would not support banning gas in the city's buildings. Something worth noting. But hopefully, this can go beyond the city because there are bills in the New York State Assembly and Senate that would effectively ban gas in buildings statewide, which would mean that New York State would do what many cities, including New York City, have just done, which is make the crucial decision to get rid of gas-powered buildings.